All right, everybody, we're about to get started. We have 92 participants on the line right now. Thanks, everybody, for being here with us. So thanks, everyone, for joining us tonight. My name is Hannah Hafter, and I serve as the Senior Program Leader for Activism at the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, and this webinar is part of the Love Resist campaign. Love Resist is a collaboration of the UUSC, where I work, and the Unitarian Universalist Association, with the mission of activating people of faith and conscience to resist criminalization of communities based on race, queer and transgender identity, religion, and even poverty. It is our piece of a movement much bigger than ourselves, seeking transformational and long-lasting change, grounded in partnership and taking the lead from those most directly impacted. We'd love it if people could introduce themselves in the chat box if you haven't already. If you don't see the chat box and you are on the online version, you can open that through the button at the bottom of your screen at the center. And where you're from. Special thank yous today to Heather Vickery of the UU College of Social Justice, who's managing the tech side of this webinar for us, and to Susan Leslie of the UUA, who is monitoring the chat box and keeping time for us, and she's right here with me. You want to say hi, Susan?
Hey, everybody, great to be here. Welcome you.
And if you are not one of the speakers, please make sure that you're on mute so that we don't have any unnecessary background noise. So today's topic is grassroots partnership. I think about how we're out here trying to build honest partnerships, but we're doing it in a deeply unequal world. And there's no way to have genuine partnership without, especially when you're working among people with vastly different experiences with privilege and oppression, without acknowledging and grappling with those fundamental inequalities. When some of us enter these collaborations with unearned advantages of race and class, how do we keep from repeating the same systems of oppression in our own organizing? How can we work towards genuinely equitable partnership while we're living inside a white supremacist culture? How do we deal with inequality in access to resources like money and time and access to people with power and influence? There's no right answer. There's really only learning and growing through the messy and beautiful work of building relationships, organizing together day after day, year after year for the long haul. Today, we're going to explore this theme of grassroots partnership in a conversation with the Minnesota UU Social Justice Alliance and their partners with March, which is the Multifaith Anti-Racism, Change, and Healing group, with Black Clergy United for Change and Black Lives Matter Minneapolis, to discuss their work together in Minneapolis to resist white supremacy. Our speakers today include Reverend Ashley Horan, the Executive Director of the Minnesota UU Social Justice Alliance, Pastor Danny Gibbons Jr. From Black Clergy United for Change and Black Lives Matter Minneapolis, Liz Loeb, Associate Director of the Kaleo Center for Faith, Justice, and Social Transformation, and Reverend Dr. Rebecca Volkel, Executive Director of the Center for Sustainable Justice. Before we get started, there are a couple things I think it's really important that we have some common definitions from the beginning. So first of all, what we mean by white supremacy. We're not talking about directly fighting the KKK and self-proclaimed white supremacists, but really looking at how all of our institutions and systems give unfair advantages to white people. White supremacy culture doesn't have to be intentional. It doesn't have to be driven by hate to lead to huge gaps in wealth and access to education, or to create institutions and spaces that just feel right and work better for white people than for people of color. For more on this subject, especially if it's new to you, there are some great resources put out by Black Lives of UU, and I'm going to stick that link into the chat box from the white supremacy teach-ins. The other piece is what we mean by grassroots partnerships or grassroots organizing. I really see grassroots organizing as building power in communities to define the solutions to their own problems and achieve them on their own terms. It's not just about what is won, but really how it's won. At the end of the day, if it isn't shifting the balance of power, restoring power to people who've had it taken away by the system through racism, homophobia, gentrification, lack of access to healthcare. It isn't grassroots organizing. So there are a lot of things we could be involved in. Policy advocacy or social justice coalitions that aren't necessarily grassroots partnerships. The reason this is so important to us and why we're focusing on the grassroots partnership side today is because we can't build a just world without a radical shift in power and deepening relationships. If you have any questions as we're going along, please type them into the chat box and we'll collect them and ask them when it's time for the Q&A. Just putting that into the chat box. So before we get started, we thought it would be interesting to know who's here and not just where people are coming from geographically, but kind of what your starting point is in terms of experience with grassroots partnerships. So we have put together a survey, and if you're in the online version of this, you can answer. I don't know if there's a way to do it on the phone. But Heather, if you could pull up the survey. We're interested in knowing if you are currently involved in strong grassroots partnerships, if you're just getting started in grassroots partnerships, maybe you're not currently in partnership with grassroots movements, but it's something you aspire to, or we may have some people on the call that are grassroots organizers that are working with faith allies. And so those are the options. There's an other box. Unfortunately, there's no way to actually to fill in a blank with the other box. But we'll give everyone a few seconds to answer that, and then we'll be able to share with everybody who's here. If you're on Zoom, you should have seen a survey pop up on your screen. You might have a program blocking pop-ups, and that might have resulted in some people not getting the poll. Heather, can you let us know how the poll is going, if most people answered?
Yeah, we have about 75% of people have voted at this point.
Great, why don't we go ahead, because I think that some people are on the phone and may not be able to. All right, so this is, it's great to see the responses. We have 28%, more than a quarter of the people here involved in strong grassroots partnerships, another 24% just starting out, 36% not currently in partnership with grassroots movements, and it's great to have you here. It's a great place to start. And 4% grassroots organizers working with faith allies, 9% other. If you want to share anything about why you feel that you're in the other category, feel free to comment on that in the chat box. Thanks. All right, so moving into the portion with our speakers, I'd like to start with Rebecca, since I know that you've been involved with March the longest. Can you tell us the story of the partnership that grew among March, Black Clergy United for Change, and Black Lives Matter Minneapolis? What have been some of the challenges and some of the successes? This is just an opportunity for all four of you to share the story from your perspective, and feel free to mute and unmute yourself and add in, debate, whatever works best for you.
Excellent. Well, I do think I'm going to start, but that we will tell this story in a perhaps not the most linear kind of a way. But one of the points that we want to make is that the lessons that we have learned around grassroots organizing and partnerships are based in concrete context and concrete relationship. And for the March Circle, it's really important to know that the circle that became March was meeting between 20 and 23 years as a multi-faith pro-LGBTQ roundtable that had a number of iterations over those years, but that we met once a month. Sometimes there were 3 of us, sometimes there were 80 of us. When there was anything that happened around LGBT organizing in our state, it was a statewide circle. The table that was called the Faith Family Fairness Alliance at one point, and we were in partnership with our statewide LGBT group. And we were very involved starting in about 2011 with the campaign to block the anti-marriage amendment in our state. And when we were successful in blocking that anti-marriage amendment on the ballot in 2012, one of the things that we had helped organize was over 1 million one-on-one conversations, a lot of which happened within religious communities. We sort of moved into a campaign to pass marriage through the legislature here in Minnesota. Then we sort of sat dormant with this amazing network of pro-LGBT religious folks from a variety of traditions, but that we weren't really utilizing that network. And then Michael Brown was murdered, and it was a number of our members said, this feels like an opportunity for us to reconvene, to think about how we might use our experience and history of rooting our work religiously and spiritually, and making a difference both in terms of cultural change, but also in terms of perhaps policy issues. And so we have been meeting since 2014, primarily first and foremost as a group of multi-faith folks who are seeking to find ways to follow the leadership of Black Lives Matter Minneapolis, of the Black Visions Collective. We have a number of indigenous organizations. A number of us were involved in the Standing Rock movement. And the model is not exclusively white religious communities and spiritual communities, but ones that may be multicultural in the makeup, but that are institutionally white organizations. How is it that we are leveraging those communities to be in support of frontline communities and primarily communities of color in direct action, in educational work, in reparations work? We have a variety of models, but that's a little bit about our the way we came into being. But the piece that I think we want to lift up is that this is not a circle that just sat down and decided to try and work on questions of racial justice and dismantling white supremacy. This was a group of folks, many of whom had many, many, many years of experience and trust built up. Liz, Ashley, Danny, other insights you might add to the story?
I think maybe we'll ask Danny to talk about BCUC and the work of Black Lives Matter Minneapolis, and then we can circle back and tie all the threads together.
So, well, thank you for having me. So with Black Lives Matter Minneapolis, what I came in at the non-indictment of Darren Wilson announcement around that November time, and there was a UU Church in Minneapolis, First Universalist, that had decided to hold vigil for folks who didn't necessarily feel called to the front line of activism at that time. There was BLM Minneapolis, I think it was like 15 Now, and a couple other organizations that had put together the 15 Now action at the McDonald's, and decided from there that, hey, we're gonna now take over the highway and march down to City Hall, because I want to say during that time that they were rallying, that this announcement came out that Darren Wilson wasn't going to be indicted. So folks just kind of organically moved as a body together. It wasn't like, to my understanding, that folks were at a table, that it kind of became that. And so I came in at that level to do a prayer at the at First Universalist Vigil, and there Lena K. Gardner who is one of the original founding members of Black Lives Matter Minneapolis, who is now the executive director of Black Lives of Unitarian Universalist. She was the keynote, and I met her, and 2 weeks later I got a phone call saying, hey, would you be willing to come and do the same thing at the Mall of America for our Black Christmas action? 1 second, I have a 3-year-old. I need you to go in the front room, please. Thank you. Bless God. I came and did the action at the Mall of America, and from there, begin doing this work I was invited to be a part of the original kind of core team. And this, to my knowledge at the time, when BLM as kind of a national movement, growing national movement was going on, many chapters weren't getting positive responses out of Black clergy because of the queer presence and the gay, the LGBTQ presence in the movement. And so a lot of the Black clergy or traditional Black churches weren't interested. And so our particular chapter was unique in the sense that we had a person of faith on the team, and that we had centered at least faith in the acknowledge of faith traditions and the acknowledge of the power of the holy as being important in our work. So that like grew a passion for me of a desire, like, hey, let's bring in more clergy of color, and thought that I would run into like open arms and be rescued by St. Bernard or something, and that didn't happen. Actually was met with a lot of resistance, but nonetheless had found the folks that I didn't know were the March Table, but there was this group of clergy that were white ally clergy from some of everywhere. They seemed to just come out of the sewers almost. And that work began this kind of thing where we were grounded in some real ways. And so I had been in communication with a few other millennial clergy from the community who had felt called to the front lines. And there was, I want to say that was the March meeting, Rebecca, if I believe, that was held at NOC. There was a meeting with all of the clergy that were present to kind of talk about the possible closing of the 4th precinct occupation for the Jamar Clark shooting in North Minneapolis. And so it was there that we all finally had an opportunity to come to the table. And from there, BCUC really formed from that table, because with the Black clergy that showed up, here's just kind of a snapshot. We're sitting at a table with traditional Black clergy, some who come from very charismatic backgrounds, some Baptist backgrounds, some Pentecostal, Seventh-day Adventists, some non-denominational, nonetheless haven't had the experience of the tapestry of faith that we get to experience as UUs. And so the introduction started out with some young lady had said that she was a pagan priestess. One person said they were a witch, and one person said that they were, Episcopalian, or whatever that was. And so my traditional Black colleagues were looking at me like, Danny, what did you walk us into? She said she's a pagan priest. That person's a witch. Like, where is God in all this? And so it became this intersectional opportunity in that, as well as an interfaith opportunity. So Black Clergy United for Change started from that table. And then we decided to write an apology letter after having been in community with the queer community, writing an apology letter on behalf of the Black church, saying that we're apologizing to the queer community for the ways that we've shunned you, ostracized you, made you feel like you are an island and don't exist and don't matter. We apologize to the young African-American males who have had this kind of absent narrative and abandonment because of kind of clothing issues or whatever that is. And we apologize to the millennials for making them not feel welcome in the church because we wanted them to conform to our norms. And that created a whole lot of drama and mayhem, but the March table proved to be this table that created this equilibrium for us. And so that's the shortest version of that story I can tell.
Beautiful. Ashley, do you want to speak a little bit to the UU grounded piece in this whole collaboration?
Yeah, sure. So I came on as the executive director of Moose Jaw, Moose Jaw, the Minnesota Unitarian Universalist Social Justice Alliance, in July of 2014. Michael Brown was killed about 3 weeks after I came into this position. And it was not the job that I had thought I was signing up for. And in fact, the incredible like movement building that happened in such a short period of time, but that I also want to emphasize was based on years and years and years of grassroots organizing in a lot of different organizations here in the Twin Cities. But I came in at a moment when it was just popping off. And so in a way that I probably wouldn't have experienced if I had been new to a city and an organizing scene, or I had been away from the Twin Cities for a long time, so I was not deeply rooted yet. But we had to make friends. We had to play well with others because we just did. The times were urgent enough that we just had to. And so early from my tenure, I was reaching out to folks in the UU circles who are already deeply involved in movement stuff. I was, some of my memories of meeting people are like, we were at the Urban League and protesting, a young Black man getting beat up by the police. And, some of the people who I met for the first time was like, while we were waiting for the police to come through with tear gas, standing out in front of the 4th Precinct during the occupation after the killing of Jamar Clark. And so in some ways, these relationships were forged in fire. And in other ways, I mean, you probably wouldn't want to see a tally of how many thousands of hours the 4 of us have spent in meetings together over the past number of years.
If it seems like we have rapport, it's because we practice a lot.
Yeah.
In meetings.
So, in terms of Moose Jaw, we, and by we, I mean I, right? So at that point, I was the only employee, half-time executive director of this very small nonprofit, working with Unitarian Universalists around the state. It just became clear that we had to leverage whatever we could in service of this movement that was being built around us and with us if we chose to participate. Somebody invited me to my first March meeting. I don't know who it was or how it happened, but I went, and I, then of course had ideas, which meant that I got to be in charge of things and got voluntold to do a bunch of things too. But over time, I think what I would say is that I have understood my work and the work of Unitarian Universalists to be as much about contributing to the ecosystem of relationship for collective liberation here in the Twin Cities as it is about anything related to specifically Unitarian Universalism. I see our organization as a vessel through which to work rather than an end game in and of itself. And I really deeply see my work as bringing people into relationship that way. I'm also aware that we haven't heard a whole lot about either the Kaleo Center or the Center for Sustainable Justice. And so I'm going to actually ask Liz and Rebecca to both do a similar thing and talk about not just your personal relationships, but your institutional relationships. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Liz Loeb. I'm the Associate Director of the Kaleo Center for Faith, Justice, and Social Transformation. I'll talk a little bit about me and then talk about the Kaleo Center and then talk about how it relates to this ecosystem. I've been a community organizer for 20 years now, and a civil rights attorney and academic. And I came to anything to do with faith organizing reluctantly. I grew up in the Jewish tradition. I'm Jewish. I'm queer. My experience of anything called faith organizing was as a place that probably didn't include me. And it was a narrow experience. I'm from the East Coast. I was highly politicized. There's a way that faith movements just weren't part of what I had experienced in movement building. I knew some of the histories of liberation theology, but not up close. And so my first assumption of anything that called itself multi-faith was that it was white, Christian, and probably not a good place for queers. And I say queers, and I should speak to anyone on this Zoom who, or on this webinar, who's LGBT, for whom queer is not a comfortable word. I would love to have that conversation with you. It's how I've spoken my identity and the culture in which I've come out and done political activism, but I recognize that's not always an okay word for other folks who are LGBT identified. So when about 8 years ago, I came to the Twin Cities as a community organizer and ended up working with Neighborhoods Organizing for Change, which it was an organization here led by and for Black folks, brown folks, and Native folks, but really especially Black folks in North Minneapolis, around work that built infrastructure for interconnected liberation through specific and concrete action. And my role as somebody who lives within whiteness and who presents as white in NOC was to talk seriously about the stake of white folks in collective resourcing and in reparations in practice. Reparations not as the endpoint of liberation, but as the repair that must be made if we are going to start even talking about our interconnected liberation. And so the more I started doing that work, the more it was folks from the March table and these folks who I'm here with now who were showing up. And I had, not only were they becoming my closest friends and comrades, but I had this light bulb moment that faith communities were organized and weren't what I thought they were. And the organizer in me said, wait, this could be easier. Like, here are all these people coming from a deep sense of value and conviction who already know how to be together in space. And we started plotting and planning. How could we participate more meaningfully in solidarity? How could we transfer the skills and practices of solidarity? And that's how I came to the Kaleo Center, because the Kaleo Center has been around since 2010, housed at United Theological Seminary, which is a Christian-based, multi-faith, pro-LGBT seminary here in the Twin Cities. And we do three things. We teach the praxis, the merging of theory and practice of social transformation to seminary students and to people who are training as faith leaders in a diverse variety of faith and spiritual communities. We build in community and in partnership to practice and mobilize into solidarity. So our theory of change is that we are going to come closest to liberation when the folks leading our movements are the folks most directly impacted by the systems we seek to change. And that there needs to be this, like, it's almost like building a bridge plank by plank and brick by brick, so that folks who have traditionally held either resources or power can see their stake in transferring those resources and power and support those movements on the front lines, so they're able to move and grow and be when needed. And then the third thing we do is at the Kaleo Center is we foster a national conversation about community organizing and social transformation as a praxis of public faith and as a field within seminary education. So I think I'll pause there. But for the Kaleo Center, our work in partnership with March and with Black Lives Matter and kind of across movement building, like, is the reason we're here. The whole point of teaching transformation is so people can show up to those struggles, because how else are we going to, any of us, have livable lives in this world?
Rebecca, will you talk to us about CSJ? Yeah.
Sure. I just want to say, like, I get to hang out with the three of these folks a lot, you know, it's amazing. I always learn something the minute either any of the three of you open your mouths. So I am a United Church of Christ pastor, and I come out of about 25 or 30 years of working at this kind of hybrid space of social justice movements, of academic study of theology and religion and movement building theory, and religious institutions. And I spent about 10 years directing the faith work for the National LGBTQ Task Force. And one of the pieces that I'm particularly interested in is some of what Liz was pointing toward. And that is, how is it that when we're looking at our multi-faith movements, and I'm particularly interested in how do we build a multi-faith kind of intersectional movement for justice, when we're looking at that, how are we paying attention to religious communities and congregations, sanghas, other local manifestations of religious communities, and how are we using the best of that organizational structure and the best of our religious traditions in order to bring about and build up a movement for justice. The Center for Sustainable Justice particularly sees itself in looking at the kind of ecosystem of spiritual, moral, and religious leadership in Minnesota, and how are we helping to sort of foster and nurture the kind of connections between congregations and communities and other social justice organizations. And I just want to lift up a piece that Liz and Ashley sort of hinted at, but that, it's the work that March is doing is not in a vacuum. There's an ecosystem of secular organizations as well as spiritual, religious, moral organizations. And part of what March is trying to do, and I in particular have interest in, is what is the particular role that March can play, and part of what I think is unique about March is it brings a kind of radical analysis that the goal of our work is about dismantling white supremacy from a very pro-LGBTQ space, and that we are playing with, I realize that I'm speaking out of my Christian context here, but theological models. So our Jewish colleagues around the circle are playing with the model of atonement as the frame for which we do some of our work. Some of those of us who are Christian are playing with a model of that so much of the work around racial justice has been historically the story of how are we working on reconciliation. And part of the critique that we're bringing is, in the face of white supremacy, and Hannah, you did a lovely job of describing white supremacy, in the face of this and its interweaving with doctrine of discovery and systems of oppression, how is it that we are providing opportunity for confession, repentance, repair, reparation work that leads to liberation, and that part of our work is that we are trying as March to play with these models that help people do this work within their religious communities. So this is not just a framework that is for individual work, but a framework for local congregations and communities to be doing this work, which is a bit of it's sort of a particular part of the ecosystem in which we're working.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm going to move into some of the questions. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is just the strength of the trust and collaboration you've been able to build came with a lot of time. And when we hear these stories, I'm sure there are some people thinking, well, how do I even take that first step? What is the first step? What does that look like? And I'll say that one of the things that I hear a lot is sometimes frustration from UUs that have reached out to potential community partners, maybe the local Black Lives Matter chapter, maybe an immigrant rights group, and they don't hear back. And then they feel kind of stuck. But there are a whole lot of other ways that relationships can start. And so I'd love to hear from you guys about what does it look like at the beginning? Recognizing it can be like awkward or uncertain, or you don't know exactly what the end goal is, that it's not always planned and signed in a contract between organizations. In fact, it pretty much never is. So how do we build from step one?
I would say step one begins with first showing up. I mean, let's just talk about the real specifics of this. I mean, ideally, this is issues that are affecting people that don't look like a majority of the folks that are on this particular webinar, and I'm grateful for, but it's this whole notion of that's where it begins. I don't know that trust begins there, but I think that the opportunity for relationship can happen there and showing up, because in showing up then creates opportunities for conversation and dialogue that could possibly build inroads into trust. And not just showing up, because if for those who aren't familiar, there was an unarmed African-American man by the name of Jamar Clark in November of 2015 that was shot by the police. There was an 18-day occupation that ensued thereafter that was co-organized by first and foremost community members from North Minneapolis, and then organizers and groups that came around to provide some support with them. During that time, there was a group of folks that actually had showed up, and they showed up and didn't necessarily have our agenda. And that resulted with 5 of our peaceful protesters being shot. So showing up in and of itself doesn't necessarily warrant like, hey, I'm here. Can't you see my BLM, band, a little bracelet or whatever? That doesn't mean that you're necessarily with what's going on. And so then I think what happens is about some of the work around volunteering and finding, the way in which you can really be fully present in that. And that may not always be in the context of what some folks come out of. Some of our congregations, folks come out of some maybe more prominent, or maybe have a little more face time or whatever that is, or are used to having a title or a role or significant title or whatever that is. And in this kind of context, that's not necessarily the thing that comes up and like, oh, you're the senior pastor of 1,500 people. Great. Be present. That's, and it's not to be insulting or dismissive. The reality is trusting in the leadership that is present in that. And so that has been my experience. And it's with this particular group, with March and Kaleo, Musja, BLM, Black Clergy United for Change, this became our relationship, in my opinion, grew out of constantly seeing these other 3 beautiful faces everywhere that I could possibly imagine showing up. But not only that, seeing these faces show up at times for me where it was often the most painstaking. It was the most, fear inspiring. It was the most, I was in hyper crisis mode, and to see other folks that once shared at least a collegial connection and being representatives of a faith was amazing for me. So that's what I'll say in short about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I would echo that. I think like the showing up, also the when you get called out on the stuff that you do that takes up space and that doesn't contribute to things, and you get called out about it, still show up again. Right? Actually, that's one of the most powerful things to do.
Yeah, you do not get to take your toys and go home.
Right. I'm also thinking of, so at the 4th Precinct, you can read all about this. There are a lot of articles written about this, but basically what happened is folks set up camp in the block surrounding the 4th Police Precinct in North Minneapolis. And they were there 24 hours a day. There were food tents and sleeping tents and fires, fire rings that people were sitting around.
In the winter.
In the winter,
in
right?
Minnesota.
It was November. And one of the things that very quickly became apparent was that people needed to go to the bathroom.
Yep.
And so I'm thinking of a group of folks, some faith folks, some folks from our local Surge chapter, a number of different places, but very quickly, without being asked, this group of folks had they figured out that this is a problem, and they were like, okay, here's the money. We found a vendor. We will get a porta potty across the street. And it was there within 24 hours.
And made the calls and were there when it was delivered. There was something about doing the grunt work that matters so much, because I have seen people who, and I can so understand, I've done it myself, oh my gosh, so many times, where you show up and you want to be thanked for showing up and given the exciting job. And this is the same thing I say to younger organizers, is it's not about paying your dues, it's about doing what's needed to be done. And having your stake be so deeply in what's needed from the work that what you're most thinking about is how can I be useful? How can I be effective? Which is a shift from thinking, how can I feel rewarded for this? And, in some ways, I feel like one of the deepest grounding points for how I understand showing up comes from the fact that I've practiced within the wisdom tradition of yoga for a long time, and complicated being a white girl practicing yoga. But it really does have a teaching around how to notice when your ego is driving the show, or whatever it is that you call ego. And I think there's such deep lessons for this work in that you really know your own stake in the work and be able to separate it from how you feel like you need to be recognized. And then you can make yourself useful. And when you've been useful long enough, maybe trust comes from that.
Thank you. And sorry, we're going to move on to the next question. But I just want to quickly note how big a difference it is to show up in people's own spaces versus inviting them into your spaces. If you're talking about a Black Lives Matter chapter, going to a meeting that is in their community versus just having a speaker come into your space where you're comfortable, where if you're white, you're the majority. It's really important to move into showing up where things are happening and where we're needed. And often that means, going places that maybe geographically aren't as accessible or we aren't as used to going to. And that's what the work of showing up really means. I want to move on to a question about healing, because it really strikes me that out of the name March, one of the things that you emphasize is healing. Can you guys talk a bit about how healing fits into the work, both in terms of interpersonal healing, which is like repair to harm when something has been said or done that's hurtful, but especially in terms of healing related to historical and structural violence of white supremacy culture? How does healing play into that? How do you integrate healing into the work?
Healing for me, again, referencing the 4th precinct, is when I had an opportunity personally to understand what healing looked like. And for me, I invited healing in the form of self-care. So a little bit about me personally. I realized outside of the 4th precinct, one of the nights standing around one of the fires that Ashley and them talked about, that after being shot at with rubber bullets and tear gas and all of these things, that I realized, Danny, what in the world are you doing out here? Are you out of your mind that you're out here in North Minneapolis in the middle of the street, 1 o'clock in the morning, it's sub-zero temperatures, and you're a Black man? You're not just any Black man. You're a Black man who has spent time in prison for shooting a police officer during a robbery, and now I also was shot myself during that process, and now I'm out here a protester of officer-involved shootings, like this kind of paradox or dichotomy, if you will, in that sense. And so I hadn't been shot at personally in 20 years by the police or anybody for that matter. And here I am, like in total trigger mode, or total trauma mode, striving to protect my community, knowing that just my skin alone is my issue, is my crime in this particular situation. And there were some folks that were part of the work that was like, hey, we have this cabin up north. If you need some time to just get away and unplug, I think you should. And I took 3 days to go and I turned off my phone. I didn't check social media, any of that. And that was the beginning of my own personal journey around self-care and seeing how important that was, because there's this thing in kind of movement work, or if you're out here doing activism work, it's almost like those reporters that chase the storm, and you have some folks that like chase the movement, that go from action to action, anything. And just this kind of work is toxic, tyrannical, and toxic, is the way that I describe it. So you have to take care of yourself, and having colleagues around me to support that, to offer resources, or whether that's books, or hey, you can come stay at my place for a little bit, or if you just need to talk and unpack, just really having that, it has proved to be amazing for me in the work.
Rebecca, do you want to add anything, or should we move to some questions from the audience? Remember to unmute yourself.
Yes, I was going to say, it looks to me like Ashley and Liz were just about to jump in. Liz was. So I will defer to you. I have something, but it doesn't, I don't need to share it now.
Clearly in a meeting, nobody can ever tell when I have something to say by my face. We're so lucky in the Twin Cities because we have a place called the People's Movement Center, which is a collective of mostly Brown, Black, Native, Indigenous, and queer folks participating in healing justice. And a dear mentor to me who works in the People's Movement Center, Susan Raffo, writes beautifully about healing justice and how it works in movements. And something she always says is that to try to start with telling the truth about your experience. And if the stakes are really high around telling the truth, if that's really hard, start with telling the truth about telling the truth. And I think that's just something that I come back to again and again when I don't know what to do. And so, yeah, that's all.
And I'll just add that I think one of the ways that we have centered healing is that we have prioritized taking care of the basic needs of the people who are leading our movements. And that sometimes has looked like doing a crowdfund to pay somebody's rent, giving each other personal loans to cover a thing, somebody's car breaks down or they can't pay their heat. It's this thing about, if somebody's family has a cabin, right? Like Danny was just talking about this, they get to go use it. Checking in with each other, creating spaciousness in meetings so that we don't just begin with an agenda that starts 2 minutes after everybody's around the table. We actually check in with each other regularly. And I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah, like we're not okay if we're not okay. And that means disrupting patterns that might exist to be there for each other and each other's safety in a deep way.
And can I add quickly also within this kind of ecosystem of March and the organizations that we part, like there's an intentionality that we have as some of us who have weathered a couple storms now around really checking in with one another and seeing where one another, like being able to kind of we've been in community with one another for time enough to, I think, read maybe some of the signs that come in that, maybe the person who is dealing with some of the weariness or fatigue may not have the heart to say, and just, to have a friend like, yo, are you okay? Do you just want to take a break for a little bit? Or I got this. Or even just saying, hey, Danny, I would love if you sat out on this one. I mean, you've done the past 3 actions. Like, you've been killing stuff. Or, I'm sorry, not killing. You've been really doing a great job in that sense. Would you, just take a time out? And so that is like, we practice healing with one another. And it's not like some kind of silo thing where I'm sneaking to the People's Movement Center and hoping nobody sees me and there's shame around it. It's a part of our being together.
All right, thanks to all of you for that. Are there any questions from our participants today? Now would be the time to ask.
Let me see.
What?
Well, one that came in, hi, this is Susan, was about should I start with my NAACP chapter? And I think what's behind the question is, where do you start in terms of relationship building and movement building and seeing who's in motion and who's looking for support?
I think we also have some people on the camera that turned on their mic in order to ask a question. So if we can take these questions in a row and then give our speakers a chance to answer them. If you are, do you know who that is? There's somebody who's 2 people on the couch. One has a beard, and you just put on the camera if you have a question to ask. All right, well, we're going to move forward with the question that Susan just shared.
NAACP. I guess I would ask this person who's saying, should I check in with NAACP, kind of like, where do you feel called to at, the intersection of justice work? I mean, I think that's where you should start. I mean, if you feel called to racial justice work that it pertains to African American folks or folks that represent that demographic, NAACP could be an opportunity to maybe understand some of the advocacy, but depending on where you are, I would love to talk with you about potential folks in our network that are out there. It's just because the NAACP varies state to state. In some of my experience, we've had a great relationship with the NAACP chapter in Minneapolis up here, but I know that that's unique to kind of our experience in local, and that's not true for the national kind of thing. And so, again, I'll share my email in the chat box, and feel free to reach out to me. I would love to kind of talk to you about some resources or ways to go at that.
Yeah, and also we here at UUSC, I mean, this is what we're here to do, is to help people figure out approaching these partnerships and how to get involved in the local organizing that's in their own community. So if you've got questions for us, we're always excited to have those conversations.
Ann
yes.
Burns is asking, could we talk a little bit more about work in rural areas, especially in support of Indigenous folks?
Is that me again? Or who?
Definitely you,
Whoever
Danny.
wants to take it. Sorry.
Okay. Well, with my new position at Musja, for those of you all don't know, I'm a statewide organizer at Musja. I started on this past August. As you can see, I'm a man of color, so I'm going to rural Minnesota, to all of these beautiful, wonderful 26 congregations that we have here. And I've had the opportunity to do a cluster gathering in Underwood, Minnesota, that involved a couple of congregations up there. So you'd have like St. Cloud and some of the congregations up in that area, for those who are familiar with Minnesota. And what I've come to see that is in Minnesota specifically, in some of these rural parts, we have immigrant populations that are existing under these kind of same oppressive dynamics that we are in the more urban or suburban kind of locales in our communities, that are striving just to have representation. For example, I was working with a group up there in Underwood that is assisting a group of Muslims in that area, helping to build a synagogue. I mean, not synagogue, a mosque, in support of their kind of coming together and having fellowship in a place like that. And so it's been that the issues sometimes can vary, maybe to a degree, or maybe not to a degree, but nonetheless, the issues of injustice and oppression exist in these rural areas. And because of, I think, with some of the sensationalism that comes around the more inner city or big city kind of issues that happen, like a Jamar Clark, a Philando Castile, or Mike Brown, that these other stories, for example, down in Wilmer, there was an African-American man that was found dead in his cell down there, an older gentleman, and the story is not lining up. And I just was in Wilmer maybe a month and a half ago doing work, and it's like these issues, the spirit of white supremacy does not discriminate between rural, inner city, urban, suburban, whatever it is, it will come and get you. and so being like mindful and not of the reality of that this thing will go anywhere to stir up its fight. So
I've seen a few other questions in the chat box, and unfortunately we're getting low on time, so we're gonna have to move on. But if people have responses to those they want to type into the chat box, that can happen there. Heather, could you please pull up the resource slide? So with these webinars and through Love Resists, we always like to be able to not only, share the stories, but also provide some resources that can help people move this work forward in their own communities and their own congregations. So Love Resists has put out an effective partnership handout. It's just a 2-pager that you can discuss with your group about how to start partnerships or how to maybe deepen the grassroots partnerships that you're in. There's a tiny URL link there, and we'll also type it into the chat box. Also, all of these links will be sent in the follow-up email. And the other resource I want to lift up is the 4-session study guide for a deeper resistance, which really explores these themes of criminalization as they're impacting a whole range of communities. They're things that individuals can use, but they're also pieces that can be used in social justice groups, worship services. There's a lot of material there that could be of interest, exploring particular aspects of criminalization as it relates to communities of color in the US, as it relates to immigrants, as it relates to Muslims. So there's a lot of useful stuff there to consider as you're thinking about who to be in partnership with that makes sense in your context and your community. So I just want to close us out with a final question for all of the speakers to have a minute each. What resources and teachings from your religious or theological tradition bring you to this work and sustain you? How about we start with Rebecca, since everyone wants to let someone else.
I was raised by people for whom their Christian practice and their practice of justice were one and the same. And particularly in this moment, I am getting deeper and deeper and deeper into not what I would call empire Christianity, but that the heart of Christianity is about resistance and resilience and building the realm of God. And my Christianity has come alive in a way that it hasn't in the past. And so for me, the theological biblical study and my prayer life are what get me up in the morning, and the fact that I get to work with people like this is just an amazing gift. So that's what's keeping me alive right now.
I guess I'll jump in now. It's my faith context as a Christian and a Unitarian Universalist, but more so my experience in being in community with this partnership. I personally have found community as a faith leader at this table, and if I would share any kind of one thing that I would say that would guide my work for those of us who kind of value writings and or texts of that nature, the Talmud has a writing on Micah 6:8, which is a biblical text, and it's also found in a Jewish context as well. But it says, "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's greed." It says, "Do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it." I'm sharing that in the chat for folks who desire to kind of have that in their thing. But that's one of like the driving mantras in my own being that keeps me grounded, healthy, and whole in this work. So that would be my advice.
Okay. I am a lifelong Unitarian Universalist, and our Universalist theology is what brings me to the table. The idea that all of us are born from love with inherent worth and dignity, and that we are in fact the agents of salvation to one another and to the world here in this life. I often say that what we call universal salvation and Unitarian Universalism is what people in the movement call collective liberation, that none of us are free until all of us are free. And we're responsible for that. And that deep teaching is at the core of my work for justice and my faith.
So I believe that connection is our birthright, that interdependence is our birthright, and that all beings are that the interconnection of all beings is the truth of the universe. And I believe that none of us are free until all of us are free. And I could talk about that coming from Judaism. I could talk about that coming from yoga. But really, in a lot of ways, I grew up reading Black feminists. I grew up on bell hooks and Audre Lorde, and they had it. So when I think about love as the most radical force we could ever have with each other, it comes from that tradition. And the probably the deepest spiritual work that's fueling me right now is Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. I really recommend everybody look it up. It is a gorgeous theology of possibility that comes from not necessarily a religious context, but from the truth of that interconnection. So it's, I wouldn't be who I was if I weren't Jewish, but when I think about what a spiritual grounding is, it's from people doing the work, who I'm so grateful to.
Well, I've gotten a lot out of this conversation, and one of the things that's really struck me is the joy, the fun, the connection. That it's very life-giving. Sometimes we think about doing social justice work and think about being drained, but when I see real relationship, when I see the kind of commitment that I see here, it's really a source of so much joy and so much meaning. So thank you for sharing that with us. And thanks for all of you who have joined us for just a glimpse into the work that's happening in Minneapolis, and excited to build with all of you in this movement. All right. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.